I never thought my own wedding would turn into the day I felt the deepest shame. They shoved my father into a corner near the restroom as if he were nothing more than an unwanted guest. No seat of honor, no tablecloth, not even his name on a card, just a plastic chair and silence. My heart shattered the moment I saw him sitting there, shoulders hunched, eyes down, as if he carried the weight of all their scorn. Rage boiled through my veins. I was the groom, yet powerless in my own celebration, watching the man who raised me treated like dirt, and then in that instant my eyes locked with the mayor. Memories of storms past, of my father climbing a roof to save his family, flashed through my mind. I typed a single message, short and sharp, and hit send. Minutes later, the mayor stood. The room froze, every laugh died, every glass stopped midair. My bride, the woman I thought I loved, trembled with fear as the truth she tried to bury began to surface. This was no longer just a wedding. It was the moment the masks cracked, when silence could no longer protect the guilty. And I had to ask myself, when the truth finally breaks free, who will still stand by my side? My name is Jonathan Miller. I am 32 years old, a man who has worked most of his life with numbers in a modest accounting office, living quietly in a small Midwestern town. Tonight should have been the proudest evening of my life, the culmination of months of planning and years of dreaming my wedding day. I believed it would be the moment when two families joined hands, when old struggles gave way to new beginnings. I believed it would be the day when my father could finally sit back and see that all his sacrifices had been worth it. That is what I told myself. That is what I wanted to believe. The hall itself was a spectacle, a glittering palace of rented grandeur. Chandeliers hung heavy above the tables, casting golden light across linen cloths imported from Italy. Each place setting gleamed with silver flatware and delicate crystal glasses. Guests arrived in polished shoes and designer gowns, perfume trailing them like banners of wealth. The Carters, my bride's family, had spared no expense, and they made sure every detail shouted their status. To the outside world, this evening looked like a triumph, but I already felt the hollowness beneath the shine. As the music played and laughter rippled through the air, I searched the tables for the one face that mattered most to me. My father, Richard Miller, the man who raised me with his hands as calloused as stone, yet as steady as any anchor, should have been near me, front and center. He should have been at a place of honor. Instead, I saw him near the back, pushed against the wall, seated at a folding chair just a few steps from the restroom doors. No name card, no tablecloth, no sign that he belonged. Just a lonely chair where no one would have to look at him. The sight cracked something in me. For a moment, the tuxedo choked my throat. I could hardly breathe as I watched him lower himself into that chair with the quiet dignity he carried everywhere. He did not complain. He did not raise his eyes in defiance. He simply accepted what had been forced upon him, as though he had spent a lifetime preparing for this very insult. My father's shoulders were slightly hunched, his old jacket folded neatly across his lap, and he sat in silence as though he were an inconvenience at his own son's wedding. I looked around, wondering if anyone else noticed. Some guests glanced at him briefly, then looked away as though embarrassed to acknowledge his presence. Others laughed too loudly, raising their glasses in toasts that drowned out the sound of my own heart breaking. Emily, my bride, sparkled at the center table, surrounded by her family, every detail of her gown. Perfect, her smile dazzling for the cameras. To everyone watching, she was the star of the evening. To me, in that moment, her brightness only deepened the shadows that swallowed my father. I wanted to stand up. I wanted to drag him to the head table and make every last one of them see the man who had built me. But my legs refused to move. Instead, I stayed seated, clapping along to speeches I did not hear, raising my glass in toasts that turned to ash in my mouth. My father sat alone, and I let it happen. The weight of my silence pressed heavier than the tuxedo across my shoulders. They shoved my father into a corner like a stain on my wedding. Those words echoed in my mind, and once spoken inside me, they refused to leave. It was as if the glittering chandeliers above dimmed, as if the music faltered in my ears until all that remained was the image of him sitting there. That image branded itself into me, cutting deeper than any wound I had ever felt. What haunted me most was his expression. There was no anger on his face, no fire in his eyes. There was only a calm sadness, a kind of resignation that said he had expected nothing more. He had endured hardship his entire life, and maybe he thought this was simply another storm to weather. But for me, seeing that resignation was worse than seeing fury. It told me he had been silenced too many times before, and now I was allowing it to happen again on the very day that was supposed to honor us both. I tried to swallow it down, to tell myself that maybe he did not care about the spotlight, that perhaps it was easier this way. Yet each time I turned my head, I caught the outline of him in that chair, and the knot in my chest pulled tighter. Every cheer, every laugh, every clink of a glass felt like an insult piling on his back. They did not just hide him, they erased him. The photographer passed by, snapping pictures of Emily and her family, their smiles wide and proud. My father was not included. No one thought to call him over. In that moment, the future I had imagined began to tilt. I wondered if this was how they treated the man who gave me everything. What did that say about the life I was stepping into? My hands trembled under the table, and I gripped the edge until my knuckles whitened. I could not stop staring at him. Richard Miller, the man who had patched my jeans with careful stitches, the man who had carried me on his shoulders so I could see fireworks above the town fair. The man who had taught me to drive with patience even when I dented the old truck. All of those memories collided with the sight of him in that corner, diminished, humiliated, invisible. I forced a smile when guests congratulated me. I shook hands, nodded, tried to play the role of the proud groom. But inside, my thoughts churned darker and darker. I knew this was only the beginning, that tonight's insult was not an accident, but a reflection of how Emily and her family truly saw him, and perhaps how they would come to see me. I tried to catch his eye, to offer some silent apology across the crowded hall. For a long time he did not look up. When at last his gaze met mine, it was not anger that I saw. It was sadness. That sadness sliced deeper than any rebuke. It was the sadness of a man who knew his worth, yet had been told once again to keep it hidden. My chest tightened. I wanted to scream, to tear down the chandeliers, to demand that everyone in the room acknowledge him. But I sat frozen, my lips pressed shut, my rage contained only within me. Still, in that moment, I realized something had shifted. The wedding I had thought was perfect had cracked. The illusion of love, family, and unity was crumbling, and the fault line was running straight through me. I looked again at Emily, radiant in her gown, basking in admiration. Then I looked back at my father, alone by the restroom, unseen. And a question thundered in my mind, louder than the music, sharper than the applause. If I could not defend him tonight, then what kind of son was I? The thought lingered like a spark in dry wood, and though I did not yet know how, I felt the beginnings of a fire that would not stay hidden. I tried to hold myself together in that hall, but the sight of my father pressed against the wall dragged me backward in time. It was as if the clinking glasses and music dissolved, replaced by the sound of rain slashing against our old roof when I was a boy. I remembered the storm that rattled the windows when water poured through the ceiling in heavy drops. My father didn't hesitate. He grabbed his hammer nails between his teeth and climbed onto the roof in the dead of night. The wind whipped at him, the rain soaking through his shirt, but he kept hammering, sealing each leak while I watched from the window, terrified he might fall. He never complained, never cursed his fate. He just worked until the roof held strong, until I was safe in a dry bed again. That was the kind of man Richard Miller was. While others slept, he battled storms with nothing but his hands and a will stronger than iron. He never asked for payment, not even gratitude. For him, it was enough to know that his family was protected. I remembered sitting under a thin blanket, shivering and thinking that no king had ever been braver than the man outside my window. The image of him balancing on that roof has stayed with me all my life, a reminder that true strength doesn't come from wealth or status, but from sacrifice. There were other nights quieter, but no less telling. Supper was often a single pot of stew stretched too thin. I would watch as my father ladled food into my bowl, then pass the pot around the table. By the time it came back to him, little remained. He would smile, push the spoon aside, and pretend he wasn't hungry. I knew the truth. His stomach growled in the silence, but he refused to take what might fill me instead. That memory burned hotter than any storm. He was a man who could go without, so that I would not. I remember his words, spoken softly but with a weight I have never forgotten, son. I can go without, but you must grow strong. His lessons were never written in books or spoken from pulpits. They were lived day by day in the quiet dignity of work. He taught me how to mend a fence, how to cut wood, how to carry myself with pride even when our pockets were empty. He showed me that respect is not bought with money but earned with the sweat of your brow. I learned that the calluses on his hands were medals, each one a testament to battles fought against poverty and hardship. And he placed those hands on mine one evening after a long day, their roughness startling me. He looked me in the eye, his grip firm, and I felt in that touch a lifetime of struggle and devotion. That was my inheritance, not wealth but values forged in hardship. Now, sitting in the glow of chandeliers, surrounded by people who had never missed a meal, I could still feel that hand holding mine. I could still see him on that roof, could still taste the thin stew he had given up so I might eat, and the injustice of it all seared deeper. How could the man who had given everything be shoved into a corner as though he were nothing? The storm he faced that night was brutal, but the storm of scorn he endured now might be worse. They could not see the hero I knew. They chose not to. The anger built inside me, rising higher than the storm winds of my childhood. I gripped the edge of the table, every fiber of me ready to burst. My father's calm, his silence only made it more unbearable. He had carried me on his shoulders when I was too small to see the world. Yet now he was invisible to everyone but me. The thought pressed into my chest like a blade. If they could erase him here at my wedding, then what else would they erase? What part of me would be next? I forced myself to smile as another toast rang out, but the glass in my hand trembled. The weight of memory and the sting of the present twisted together into a knot of fury. I knew then that silence was no longer an option. Something had to break, and though I did not yet know how, I felt the storm that had always surrounded my father begin to stir within me, waiting for its moment to strike. I could not shake the weight of those memories, the storms my father endured and the sacrifices he made in Suntz. They followed me even as life began to shift in another direction, when the world presented me with someone who seemed like light after all that shadow. Her name was Emily Carter, and I first met her in the neat, sterile corridors of the firm where I worked. She was visiting as part of a marketing partnership, polished and confident in a way that seemed foreign to me. While I wore the same suit for years and carried the weight of rent and bills in every paycheck, Emily floated through those offices as though the world was hers to command. She was beautiful, yes, But it was not only beauty that drew me in. She had a way of making me feel seen, as if I was more than the quiet accountant from the modest side of town. We began to talk after meetings, then lingered over coffee. Her laughter easy and disarming. For a man who had grown up patching roofs and stretching meals, her attention felt like a door opening into another life. I convinced myself that maybe she saw in me something no one else had. Maybe this was my chance to rise above the limits I had inherited. Our relationship grew quickly. Walks after work turned into dinners, and dinners turned into whispered plans for a future. I believed that fate had finally decided to reward me. When I looked at Emily, I saw not only a woman I could love, but also a bridge to a world I had only glimpsed in magazines and movies. The Carter family name was old and powerful in our town, tied to businesses and wealth that stretched back generations. To me, it felt like stepping out of the shadows and into the light, but shadows have a way of clinging. The first time my father met Emily was not in some formal dinner or staged introduction. He had driven me across town on a Saturday, his old truck rattling with every pothole. He insisted on coming along, eager to meet the woman who had stolen his son's heart. He wore his cleanest shirt, the one he saved for church, pressed carefully, though frayed at the cuffs. I remember the pride in his voice as he asked questions about her, his eyes hopeful. When we pulled up to Emily's home, the contrast was jarring: a sprawling house with stone pillars, shining windows, and a manicured lawn that seemed like another world compared to our cracked sidewalks. I walked up to the door with my father just a step behind me. Emily answered herself, dressed casually but elegant in a way that made me hesitate before speaking. I introduced them quickly, my voice carrying both excitement and nerves. She smiled polite, but her eyes flicked past him in a fleeting glance that I almost missed. Before I could ask her to invite us in, she leaned toward me and whispered something I would never forget. She said, "Sorry, it's not a good time," her tone sweet on the surface, but firm beneath. Then she looked at my father and offered only the smallest nod before closing the door behind her. The air outside was colder than I remembered. My father stood there, hands in his pockets, pretending not to notice. He shifted his weight from one foot to the other. His smile faint but steady, as if he wanted to shield me from embarrassment. But I felt it burn anyway, a flush rising in my cheeks, as though the whole neighborhood had watched us turned away. My heart hammered with shame, not only for him but for myself, for not knowing how to protest, for allowing her dismissal to stand. He was left standing on that porch like a man who had wandered where he did not belong, and I could do nothing but mumble an excuse and lead him back to the truck. That moment should have been a warning. It should have been the first crack in the perfect image I was building of her. Yet I buried it, told myself she must have had a reason. Maybe her parents were not ready. Maybe she was embarrassed by the suddenness of it. I clung to those excuses because the alternative, that she was ashamed of him and by extension of me, was too painful to accept. I wanted the dream too badly, wanted to believe that love could erase the divide between her world and mine. So I let it go, or at least pretended to. But even as I tried to forget, the image lingered: my father standing on that porch, the cold air cutting against his face while the door closed with a quiet finality. It lodged in me like a splinter I refused to pull. I pushed forward with Emily, chasing the promise of a future, ignoring the voice inside me that whispered of danger. That silence, that choice to overlook, would come back to haunt me. And deep down I already knew that the door closing that day was more than just a house shutting us out. It was the first door closing on my father's dignity. And once a door like that closes, it has a way of slamming harder the next time. Dinner at the Carter's house was an event dressed in quiet ceremony and unspoken judgment. The moment I stepped through the tall wooden doors, I felt the divide widen between our worlds. Their dining room glowed with the warmth of polished mahogany crystal chandeliers and paintings that seemed to whisper of generations of wealth. The air smelled of roasted lamb and expensive wine, but beneath the aroma lingered something sharper, something I could not name at the time. It was the scent of evaluation of scrutiny disguised as hospitality. We were seated at a table long enough to host a small council. Carter Sr. took his place at the head, his posture as rigid as the carved chair back behind him. Emily sat beside me, radiant but tense, as though her smile were a mask carefully pinned in place. Her mother drifted between the chairs, offering dishes with a graciousness that never reached her eyes. Across the table, I could see her glance fall on my father's hands, scarred, weathered, marked by decades of carpentry. Her lips tightened ever so slightly, and she turned her attention back to the silver serving spoon as if the sight had unsettled her. My chest burned at the gesture, though no one else seemed to notice. As the meal settled into small talk, Carter Sr. began his quiet interrogation. He asked about my work with the precision of a man accustomed to numbers that always added up in his favor. "And what do you earn, Jonathan?" He pressed his voice, smooth but edged. I told him honestly, the figure modest compared to his expectations. His response was a chuckle followed by a story of his friend's son, Harvard-educated, corner office in Chicago, six-figure salary before 30. The comparison landed like a blade across my pride. I forced a polite smile, but inside I seethed. I could feel Emily's hand brush my knee under the table, a silent signal to stay quiet. The meal continued, each course heavier than the last, not for its richness, but for the weight of unspoken truths. I tried to remind myself that families test newcomers, that maybe this was nothing more than formality. But when the plates were cleared and the glasses refilled, Carter Sr. leaned back in his chair, folded his hands, and shifted the evening into its true purpose. He spoke without hesitation, his voice measured as though he had practiced the lines. "Jonathan, I think it would be wise for you and Emily to sign a prenuptial agreement. It's just to protect our family's assets." The words rang in my ears, the phrase wrapped in velvet but carrying the sting of a whip. My fork paused mid-air. I looked across the table, waiting for Emily to speak, to defend us, but she only stared down at her plate. My father cleared his throat softly, a quiet sound that seemed to echo louder than the chandelier's hum. Before I could form a response, I felt Emily's fingers tighten around mine under the table, her grip firm, commanding. She leaned closer, her whisper sharp enough to cut. "Don't complicate things." That grip was colder than any storm I had ever known. Her father's gaze never wavered, steady as steel, as though he expected my agreement without question. My father looked at me then, his eyes not angry but filled with something worse, hurt. Mixed with restraint, the silent endurance of a man too proud to plead. I swallowed hard, tasting bitterness instead of wine. I nodded faintly, though every fiber of me screamed against it. The room moved on, conversation shifting back to politics and business as though nothing monumental had been spoken. But in my mind, the sentence was carved deep. Protect our family's assets. The subtext was clear. I was not one of them, and my father certainly was not. Their wealth was a fortress, and I was being reminded that my place inside it would always be conditional. That night, as we left the Carters' home, the air outside was crisp, yet it carried none of the relief I longed for. I caught sight of my father walking a step behind me, his shoulders slightly bowed, his hands tucked in his jacket. The image seared itself into me. I wanted to say something, anything, but the silence between us pressed heavier than words. Even then, I told myself it was only one evening, that things would smooth over in time. But deep inside, I knew the truth. This was no test. This was a declaration. Wealth and power had already drawn their line, and they had placed my father and me firmly on the wrong side. And as I climbed into Emily's car, her perfume filling the air, I realized the grip of her hand still lingered on mine. It was a grip that warned me, a grip that silenced me. And I began to wonder how long I could ignore the sound of that silence before it broke me completely. The dinner at the Carter's house had left me uneasy. But I told myself that maybe the wedding would be different, that once the day arrived, everyone would focus on love rather than power. That hope didn't last. From the very start of the planning, Emily seized control of every detail. She spoke with florists, caterers, musicians, and venue managers as if I were merely a guest at my own wedding. My suggestions were politely waved aside or twisted into her version of what was best. Every time I tried to insert myself, she smiled and said she had already taken care of it. The message was clear: this was her stage and I was a supporting actor. I remember the first argument over music. I suggested including a song that meant something to my father and me, one he used to hum when fixing things around the house. Emily laughed softly, then shook her head. "It won't fit the theme," she said. "Besides, my family expects something more refined." The words cut sharper than she realized. It wasn't just about the music. It was about whose voices mattered and whose didn't. Soon, the same pattern unfolded with the menu, the color scheme, even the officiant. Each choice leaned toward what the Carters wanted, never what the Millers valued. When the seating chart was drawn up, the insult deepened. Emily unrolled the plan across the kitchen table one evening, pointing to the prime seats filled with her relatives, business associates, and family friends. When I asked where my father would sit, she tapped a corner near the kitchen doors, brushing it off with a quick, "He'll be more comfortable there." I stared at the tiny square with his name scribbled smaller than the rest, comfortable. It was exile disguised as courtesy. The worst came weeks before the wedding, when I stumbled across the invoices tucked neatly into a folder. At first, I thought they were standard bills, but as I flipped through the papers, my stomach twisted. Every contract, the venue, the caterer, the decor was signed under Carter Sr.'s name. And at the bottom of the stack was a single page with a blank line where my signature was meant to go. Emily explained it casually when I confronted her. "Daddy fronted most of the expenses," she said. "It'll look better if your name is there too. Just sign it. It's about appearances." I knew what it meant. They were paying, they were controlling, and my role was to legitimize it. I held the pen in my hand, but couldn't bring myself to sign. My throat tightened, words catching as I tried to tell her it didn't feel right. Her eyes flashed annoyance, the mask slipping for just a second. She reached across the table, pressed her fingers hard against my wrist, and whispered, "Don't ruin this." The grip was firm, commanding, leaving no room for argument. My protest died in my chest. Later that night, when I tried again to explain how it hurt to see my father pushed aside, Emily silenced me with another phrase delivered in that same honeyed tone that made resistance feel foolish. "This isn't about your father, Jonathan. It's about us." The words should have been reassuring, but instead they hollowed me out. Because in that moment I understood that us meant Emily and her family, not Emily and me. Each decision, each signature, each dismissal was another brick in the wall they were building around me. And though I stayed silent, the anger pressed harder with every stone. My father was being erased before the wedding even began, and I was complicit by doing nothing. I could feel the resentment growing inside me like a storm cloud waiting for its chance to break. As the day drew nearer, I stared at that seating chart. Late into the night, my father's name pushed into the shadows. My hand hovered over the phone, tempted to call him, to warn him, to tell him what awaited, but I stopped myself, afraid of the pain in his voice if he knew the truth. Instead, I set the chart aside, my pulse pounding with the weight of betrayal. And somewhere deep down I knew when the wedding day came, something would snap. The cracks already forming in the illusion could not hold forever. The weeks of planning had blurred into a haze of contracts and compromises, but nothing could have prepared me for the reality of the wedding day. The moment I walked into the hall, I felt the imbalance as sharply as if the air itself tilted toward the Carter side. Their guests arrived in clusters, their laughter ringing too loudly, filling the space with perfume and bravado. They occupied the best tables, their chairs drawn close together in a display of belonging. My family, scattered and subdued, seemed swallowed by the noise. I tried to focus on the ceremony, on the vows spoken beneath the chandeliers, but even as I stood at the altar, my eyes kept drifting toward the back. There sat my father, Richard, tucked near the kitchen doors, a place where the servers brushed past with trays of food as though he were one more piece of furniture in their way. The insult was deliberate, carefully staged beneath the veneer of organization. My chest tightened with every glimpse of him. The distance between where he sat and where he should have been. During the reception, as glasses clinked and music rose, the difference became impossible to ignore. Emily's relatives laughed with the unguarded ease of those who believed they owned the night. One of her uncles, already red-faced with drink, glanced toward the corner where my father sat. His lips curled into a smirk, and then the words came sharp enough to slice through the hum of conversation. "Who let the handyman in?" The table erupted in laughter, and before I could react, I saw Emily cover her mouth, stifling a giggle she did not bother to hide. My heart stopped. The sound of her laughter landed harder than the insult itself. In that instant, something inside me collapsed. She was supposed to be my partner, my defender. Instead, she had chosen the chorus that mocked the man who had given me everything. I felt heat rise in my face, a burn that was equal parts shame and rage. The blood roared in my ears, drowning out the music, drowning out every voice except that echoing laughter. I turned my eyes back to my father, desperate to see how he bore the cruelty. He sat perfectly still, his shoulders drawn slightly inward, his hands folded neatly in his lap. His gaze stayed lowered, fixed on the table before him, as though he had not heard, though I knew he had. He did not rise, did not defend himself, did not cast a look of reproach toward anyone. He simply absorbed the humiliation as he had absorbed so many storms before. That silence, that endurance was worse than an outburst. It was proof that he expected this treatment, proof that he had lived his life being overlooked, and now even his son had failed to shield him. In that moment, I saw him not as the man who had carried me on his shoulders through carnivals, not as the man who had patched roofs and skipped meals. He looked like a shadow dimmed by the lights and laughter that ignored him. The words formed in my mind, searing and final. He sat there like a ghost at my own wedding. The injustice pressed down on me with crushing weight. I wanted to stand, to shout, to drag him to the center of the room and force every guest to look at him, to see him for who he was. But my body betrayed me. I sat rooted in place, my fists clenched under the table, my teeth grinding until my jaw ached. I told myself I had to keep the peace, that this was not the moment. Yet each second that passed only deepened the wound, each laugh from their side of the room, another nail driven into my resolve. Emily leaned close, brushing her hand against mine, her smile still painted on for the guests. She whispered something trivial about the flowers, as if nothing had happened, as if she could pretend her laughter had not cut me to the bone. I did not respond. My silence was no longer the silence of acceptance, but of something darker, something coiling deep inside me, waiting. The band struck up another tune and the crowd cheered, but I heard none of it. All I could see was my father's bent figure in the corner, surrounded by shadows, and all I could feel was the fire rising in my chest. I knew then that this was the breaking point, the moment I could no longer pretend. And as I sat there, blood boiling, I caught the faintest movement, my father's eyes lifting for a brief second to meet mine. The sadness in them was unbearable, and I knew something inside me had shifted for good. I would not leave this night unchanged. Something was coming, and when it broke, no one in that hall would be able to ignore it. The laughter that followed the cruel remark still rang in my ears long after the music swallowed it. My bride's smile, her family's smug glances, the way my father sat bowed in silence. They all pressed into me at once until I felt as though the walls of the hall were closing in. My blood burned hot, but beneath that heat lived something heavier, colder, shame. I could not shake the image of my father bent over patching roofs in the rain or slipping me his portion of food when the stew ran thin. Those sacrifices replayed in my mind like fragments of a film, each one striking harder than the last. He had spent his life building me, and now I was watching him be dismantled piece by people who had never lifted a hammer in their lives. I gripped the edge of my chair, fighting to breathe through the storm rising inside me. My thoughts spun toward every lesson he had taught me, the quiet dignity he had carried through hardship. He never sought applause, never asked for recognition, yet here he was being humiliated, erased as though his life's worth had no weight. The injustice of it all surged like a tide battering at the dam of my composure. If I stayed silent, I wasn't just betraying him, I was betraying myself. It was then that I felt a sudden icy pressure on my hand beneath the table. Emily's mother leaned closer, her face arranged in a mask of grace for the guests, but her fingers tightened around mine like a shackle. She didn't look at me directly, but her words slid into my ear with a quiet venom. "Remember your place," the command hit like a lash, a reminder that to them I was a guest in their kingdom, not a man with his own legacy. The rage boiled higher. I turned my gaze across the room and locked onto my father. He still sat in that corner, shoulders hunched, but then he lifted his head just slightly. Our eyes met. In that moment, the world went silent. There was no laughter, no music, no chatter of forks against plates. There were only his eyes, tired and shadowed, carrying a sadness so deep it hollowed me out. It wasn't disappointment I saw there, it was resignation. The same resignation I had seen years ago when he went hungry so that I could eat. He had learned to expect less, and that truth cut deeper than any insult. My chest tightened as the thought slammed into me. If Emily could erase my father from this night, she could erase me just as easily. If she could strip him of dignity, she would strip me of my voice, my identity, my worth. If she can erase my father, she can erase me too. The words seared through me like fire, spoken silently in my mind, but with a clarity that could not be denied. I clenched my jaw, the weight of silence, no longer a refuge but a prison. Every moment I allowed to pass gave her more power, gave them more ground. My father had endured storms his whole life, but this storm was mine to face, and I knew the cost of ignoring it. The blood in my veins pounded against my skin, demanding action. Emily leaned toward me, then her perfume sweet but suffocating. She whispered something light about greeting the next set of guests, her tone so casual as if nothing had happened. I didn't answer. My eyes never left my father. I saw him as he truly was, the man who had built me with bare hands, the man who had sacrificed without complaint, now sitting invisible in a room that should have honored him. The music swelled, the guests clapped to the beat, but I was already somewhere else, my mind clawing for a way to shatter the charade. I knew one thing for certain: the night could not continue like this. Something had to break. And as I scanned the hall, my eyes caught a figure at the front tables, a figure I had almost forgotten until now. The sight made my pulse quicken, my breath catch, because in that moment I realized the key to everything might be closer than I thought. My eyes swept the hall, still burning from the weight of my father's sunness, when they stopped at the front table. Among the polished guests in shining gowns sat Mayor Thomas, his presence commanding even in silence. He wore his suit with the confidence of a man accustomed to authority, yet his face carried the same calm expression I remembered from years ago. Seeing him there so close, so unaware of what was unfolding in the corner of the room, struck me like a bolt of lightning. In that instant, memory surged forward, vivid and relentless. I was 17 again, standing barefoot in the mud of our yard, watching rain slash sideways across our small town. The storm that night had ripped power lines to the ground and peeled shingles from roofs like paper. Most families huddled inside praying for morning, but my father had thrown on his jacket, grabbed his tool belt, and stepped out into the chaos. "People need help," he said simply before disappearing into the downpour. I followed him, stumbling through the storm, and that's when we reached the mayor's house. The roof sagged, water pouring into the living room while his children crooned. Without hesitation, my father climbed the ladder, rain blinding him, wind threatening to hurl him into the dark, nails clamped between his teeth, hammer in hand. He fought against nature itself. I will never forget the way the lightning lit his figure against the black sky, a lone man holding back the storm so a family could sleep in safety. He worked until his fingers bled, until the roof held strong, and when it was over, he never asked for thanks. He only said it's what needed to be done. The memory hit me with such force that my throat closed. My eyes burned, and before I could stop myself, tears welled. How could anyone look at him now, hunched in the shadows of my wedding, and not see the same man who once saved a household from ruin? How could Emily laugh? How could her family sneer when the very leader of this town owed his comfort to the man they now dismissed as a stain? The injustice was too sharp to swallow. I gripped my glass, my hand trembling as I stared at the mayor. He laughed at a joke from one of Emily's uncles, oblivious to the storm gathering in me. My breath came in shallow bursts, the rage and grief twisting together until I thought I might shatter. I whispered to myself words meant more as a vow than a statement. A man like that should never be forgotten. The phrase seared through me, clearing the haze in my mind. For the first time that night, I saw not only the cruelty but also the possibility. Mayor Thomas was here within reach. He was proof living and breathing of my father's worth. If anyone could remind this hall of who Richard Miller truly was, it was him. The Carters might dismiss my words as weakness, the guests might laugh at my protests, but they could not deny the testimony of the town's most powerful man. My chest tightened, heart pounding faster than the band's rhythm. The pieces began to align in my head. My father's humiliation, my silence, the mayor's presence. This was no coincidence. This was the moment, perhaps the only moment, to return dignity where it belonged. I wiped at my eyes quickly, afraid someone might see the tears and mistake them for weakness when in truth they were fuel. As I sat there, locked on the mayor's calm profile, the noise of the room faded into a dull roar. Emily's laughter, her family's chatter, the music, all of it receded until there was only him, the man who owed my father more than he likely remembered. My pulse hammered in my ears, the weight of decision pressing down. Then, almost as if fate itself had tilted the room, the mayor turned his head, slightly scanning the hall. For a fleeting second, his gaze brushed past mine. The spark of recognition had not yet come, but I felt the connection like a current running through me. My decision was no longer a question of if, but of when. And as I set my glass down, my mind already forming the words I might send, I realized the next move would decide everything. One message, one choice could rip the mask from this night and force the truth into the open. My gaze clung to the mayor at the front table, the only man in the room who carried proof of who my father truly was. The weight of that realization pressed down on me until I could hardly sit still. My hands drifted toward my pocket fingers, brushing the outline of my phone. It felt heavier than steel, as though it contained the key to everything. I hesitated, my pulse pounding as voices around me blurred into meaningless noise. I slipped the phone out beneath the table, shielding the glow of the screen from curious ease. For a long moment, my thumb hovered over the keyboard, frozen. Should I reach out to the lawyer I trusted, the friend who could later expose the Carters' schemes through contracts and laws? That path promised justice, but justice that moved too slowly. The humiliation of my father was happening now under the chandeliers in full view of the town. The courtroom could wait, but tonight could not. I lifted my eyes again to the mayor. His head tilted back slightly as he listened to a joke, smiling politely, unaware of the storm I was trapped in. The memory of that night, the storm, the collapsing roof, the hammer ringing out through thunder, rushed back with such force that my eyes stung. My father had saved that man's home, protected his children. If the mayor could speak here, if he could stand up in this very hall, no one could deny the truth. That thought steadied my trembling hand. The words I typed were simple, stripped bare of hesitation. Sir, my father saved your family once. Please don't let them erase him tonight. I stared at the line, my chest tightening as if I had carved a piece of my heart onto the screen. My thumb hovered again, doubt gnawing at me. What if he dismissed it? What if Emily saw? What if nothing changed? Then my eyes fell back on my father, still bowed in the corner, and I pressed send. The message shot into the air, my breath catching with it. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. I set the phone face down, my hands slick with sweat. The music swelled, laughter roared, and I sat still, feeling as though the entire hall balanced on the weight of a single text. My eyes flicked toward the mayor. His phone lit up against the white tablecloth. He picked it up, glanced down, and then slowly lifted his gaze to meet mine across the room. It was a brief look, but it froze me in place. Recognition dawned in his expression, not the kind born of memory alone, but of understanding. He straightened his posture, shifting with quiet gravity. Then almost imperceptibly he gave a small nod. Relief and terror collided in me at once. The words thundered through my mind, one message can turn the tide. The nod was enough to send a tremor through my chest. I felt as though the hall itself had tilted, that for the first time in hours, maybe in months, the weight was no longer mine to carry alone. But the danger was not over. Emily noticed my sudden stillness, her eyes narrowing. She leaned closer, her perfume cloying, her whisper cutting into my ear. "What did you just do?" I didn't answer. My lips pressed tight, my eyes fixed on the man who now held the room's future in his hands. The mayor set his phone aside and leaned toward his wife, murmuring something that drew her startled glance. She touched his arm, her expression shifting to one of disbelief. Slowly, deliberately, he adjusted his jacket as though preparing himself. My pulse hammered harder because I knew that the next moments would decide everything. As he placed his hands on the table and began to rise, the scrape of his chair against the floor sent a shiver through the air. Conversations dipped, laughter faltered, and heads began to turn. The illusion that Emily's family had built so carefully was about to face its first crack. And I knew in my bones that once the crack spread, there would be no patching it back together. The scrape of the mayor's chair against the floor cut through the hum of conversation like a blade. At first, only a few heads turned, curious but unconcerned. Then he straightened his jacket, cleared his throat, and began to walk toward the podium. Each step echoed in the vast hall, carrying a weight that silenced laughter and drew eyes away from the glittering center tables. By the time he reached the microphone, the room had already begun to hush, anticipation thickening in the air. He rested one hand on the podium, the other adjusting the microphone. The speakers gave a faint buzz sharp enough to command complete silence. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice steady and deliberate. "I had not planned to speak tonight, but there are times when silence does more harm than words. And tonight silence has gone on long enough." The hush deepened until even the clinking of glasses stopped. Emily's family shifted in their seats, stiff smiles plastered on their faces as though they could will him back into polite irrelevance. But the mayor pressed on, his gaze swept across the hall until it landed on my father, still seated near the kitchen doors, his shoulders hunched. "There is a man in this room," the mayor said, his voice rising with conviction. "A man who has never sought the spotlight, who has never asked for recognition, and yet whose character has carried this town more times than most will ever know." A ripple of confusion moved through the guests. My breath caught as he continued. "Years ago, when a storm tore through this town, my own home was nearly destroyed. The roof collapsed, water poured through, and my children cried as the rain beat down. That night it was Richard Miller who showed up at my door, drenched to the bone, hammer in hand. He climbed my roof in the middle of the storm and worked until the house was saved. He asked for nothing. He never spoke of it again. But I remember, and I will never forget." Gasps sounded from several tables. Guests craned their necks to look toward my father, whose eyes widened in disbelief. I felt tears sting my own eyes, pride surging so fiercely it was almost painful. Then came the sound that split the air glass, shattering. Emily's hand had slipped her wine, spilling across the white linen as the stem of her glass rolled away. Her face drained of color, and for the first time all evening her perfect mask cracked. The mayor's eyes narrowed slightly, his words gaining sharper edge. "We forgot what honor truly means. Tonight let us remember. Richard Miller is not a man to be hidden in the shadows. He is a man of integrity, of sacrifice, of quiet strength, and it is a disgrace that he sits in a corner tonight while others bask in borrowed light." His final words struck like a hammer, reverberating across the room. "We forgot what honor truly means. Tonight let us remember." For a moment the hall was frozen, caught between shock and awakening. Then the applause began. It was hesitant at first, scattered claps that quickly swelled into thunder rolling through the chandeliers. Guests rose to their feet, cheering, some shouting Richard's name. My father lowered his head, overwhelmed, his trembling hands gripping the edge of the table. I looked at Emily. Her smile was gone, replaced by the tight line of panic. Her parents' faces burned with humiliation, their carefully built facade collapsing under the weight of truth. Around them their guests no longer offered admiration but judgment, eyes narrowing, whispers spreading. The fortress of control they had crafted was crumbling, and nothing could stop it now. My chest heaved as I stood frozen in place, caught between relief and fury. The mayor's words had cracked the night wide open, but the spotlight was shifting. I felt it, dozens of eyes turning toward me, waiting to see where I stood, and as I met my father's gaze, tears brimming in his eyes, I knew that silence was no longer possible. The next move was mine. The roar of applause still echoed from the mayor's words when Emily leaned close, her nails digging into my wrist beneath the table. Her voice was a whisper sharpened to a blade. "Don't you dare!" The threat was quiet enough to be hidden from the crowd, but it sliced through me with brutal clarity. For months I had obeyed those words in different forms. Don't complicate things, don't ruin this, don't make a scene. Tonight that leash finally snapped. I rose from my chair, the movement drawing a sudden hush from those nearest to me. Emily's grip slipped away, her eyes wide with disbelief. My legs felt heavy, but with each step across the hall they grew stronger, steadier. Guests parted without a word, creating a path as though they sensed something larger than themselves was unfolding. The chandeliers glittered above, but my focus narrowed until I saw only one man. My father still sat hunched near the kitchen doors, confusion flickering in his eyes as I approached. The applause from earlier had not reached him. He looked smaller than I remembered, as though the years of labor and quiet dismissal had finally pressed him into the shadows. I stopped before him, and without hesitation I dropped to my knees. A collective gasp swept through the hall, sharp as breaking glass. His calloused hands twitched against his lap as if uncertain where to go. "You don't have to do this, son," he murmured, his voice low, almost pleading. The words struck me hard because they came from the same man who had weathered storms in Solence, who had given everything without expectation. Even now, in the middle of his humiliation, he wanted to shield me. But I shook my head, my voice breaking yet louder than I intended. "I should have done this long ago." The sentence rang through the hall like a confession, like a verdict passed on myself. I reached for his hands, rough and scarred, lifting them so everyone could see. The silence that followed was electric, the kind that carries both judgment and awe. Then, as if a fuse had been lit, the clapping began again. First scattered, then swelling into a wave. Some guests stood, their faces alight with admiration or relief, while others remained seated, their expressions tight, unwilling to defy the Carters openly. The sound was uneven, fractured, but real. It filled the hall with something raw, something that felt like justice clawing its way into the open. Emily stood frozen at the center table, her wine-stained gown trembling with her shoulders. Her face, once painted with poise, was drained and brittle. Her parents exchanged glances, their humiliation complete, their empire of appearances collapsing under the weight of truth they could no longer contain. I did not look at them. I could not. My entire focus was on the man before me, whose tears welled as he gripped my shoulders, torn between pride and disbelief. The applause ebbed and flowed, a storm within the hall. Some clapped out of respect, others out of defiance, and a few remained silent, their loyalty chained to wealth rather than honor. But I no longer cared. The choice had been made. The tide had turned. I stood then, keeping my father at my side, no longer hidden, no longer alone. For the first time all night I felt taller than the chandeliers above me. My bride's voice tried to cut through the noise, her sharp whisper trembling with panic. But I didn't turn to her. I knew what had been broken could not be repaired. And as I looked out across the hall with my father standing beside me, and the Carters unraveling before my eyes, I felt the sense of a decision that could not be undone. The next words I spoke would not only end a marriage before it began, but would mark the line I would never cross again. The hall still rang with scattered applause when I took my father's arm and led him forward. For the first time that night, he did not resist. His steps were slow, uncertain, but as we crossed the floor together, I felt the room shift around us. Whispers followed, heads bent close in hurried conversation. The Carters sat rigid at their table, faces pale, the illusion of power stripped from them in front of their own guests. Emily stood frozen, her hands trembling against the white cloth, her eyes wide and vacant. The gown that had been meant to dazzle now hung heavy, stained with spilled wine and shame. She tried to force a smile, tried to hold the fragments of her composure, but the crack was too deep. Her mask had broken, and all that remained was fear. For a moment she looked at me as though I might turn back, as though the weight of tradition could pull me into silence again. But I kept walking, my father at my side, until the great doors opened and the night air wrapped around us. Outside, the cool darkness was a relief after the suffocating lights. My father inhaled deeply, his shoulders trembling as though he had carried a burden for too long and only now felt at ease. We did not speak right away. Words seemed too small for what had just happened. The sounds of the hall, the gasps, the whispers, the applause faded behind us, leaving only the steady rhythm of our footsteps as we walked into the night. Inside, I knew chaos reigned. Guests would argue, sides would be taken, reputations would be measured against what they had just witnessed. The Carters had lost their stage. They had lost the one thing they prized above all else: control. And Emily, left alone at the center of it all, had lost me. Days later, the aftermath arrived in the form of an email. Its tone was cold, legal, and precise. They accused me of breach of contract, of humiliating their family, of sabotaging what had been arranged. They threatened lawsuits, financial ruin, the weight of their influence pressing once more. For a moment, as I read the words on the glowing screen, the old fear tried to return. The fear of being crushed, of being erased, of being made small. But then I remembered the night of the storm, the sound of hammers striking against rain, the sight of my father saving a house while lightning split the sky. I remembered the mayor's voice at the podium, the crowd rising to its feet, the hall forced to see the truth they had tried to bury. And most of all, I remembered the feel of my father's hand on my shoulder when I knelt before him, the weight of pride and love in his touch. I laughed softly, a sound colder than I expected. "Let them try," I whispered to the empty room. "This time I won't be silent." The words carried more than defiance, they carried a promise. For too long I had swallowed humiliation, let others dictate the worth of my father and myself. That era was over. As I closed the laptop, I felt a calm settle over me. Revenge did not always roar. Sometimes it whispered in the choices we made, in the refusal to bow again. The Carters could file their papers, spread their rumors, fight their battles in boardrooms and courts. But the truth had already been spoken under the chandeliers in front of witnesses who would not forget. That truth was stronger than any contract, stronger than wealth, stronger than shame. Looking at my father sitting quietly across the room, his hands folded, I thought of all the storms he had endured. Tonight, for the first time, I had faced mine. And I understood something he had always known: dignity once reclaimed cannot be taken again. The night had been meant as my wedding, but it had become something else entirely. It was the night I chose my father, the night I chose myself, and the night the world learned that some truths refuse to be buried. And as the memory of that hall returned to me, filled with silence and then thunderous applause, I asked myself the only question that mattered: how many storms had to break before people finally remembered what honor truly meant? And that was the night everything changed. Not just for me, but for everyone who thought silence could bury the truth. My father's dignity was restored, and I learned that family honor is worth more than any contract, any fortune, or any false smile. If this story moved you, if it stirred your anger and your hope, I ask you to stay with us. Subscribe to this channel, share your thoughts in the comments, and tell me, what would you have done if it was your father pushed into the shadows?